Welcome to this episode of Book Talk with Cara. And today I'm delighted to introduce you to Sarah Loudin Thomas and her new book, These Tangled Threads. Now, one of the reasons I am excited to have her on today, in addition to just introducing you to another lovely author friend of mine, is that her new book is set at the Biltmore. And the Biltmore is one of my favorite places to go and visit. I love it because it's America's castle and it's nestled in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I think it's kind of one of those little nestled jewels that a lot of people aren't really aware of. So when I saw that this new book is set at the Biltmore, I was like, I have to know more. So Sarah, before we start like gushing too much about the Biltmore, I want to give you just a moment to introduce yourselves and then we'll start gushing.
Okay. Well, Sarah Loudin Thomas. I write Appalachian historical fiction. I joke that there are about three of us who fit in that genre, me, Cindy Sproles, and Ann Gabhart sometimes. Um, but I love to write about these Appalachian mountains. I'm a native of West Virginia, a seventh generation West Virginian. So my roots run deep in this part of the world. And I just love sharing my love of these mountains with readers.
I love that because there's something really fun that comes out in the writing when we're writing about things that we have a like true passion for. And so it readers can see it. We can feel it when that kind of sparks into the writing. So how did you decide on the Biltmore for the setting for These Tangled Threads?
Well, that's kind of funny. Because I write Appalachian historical about the common people of Appalachia. I said I'm a seventh generation person. I have family members who go way back, and these are coal miners and farmers and people like that. And my editor came to me and said, we'd really like a book about Biltmore Estate. And I said, have you read my books? Because this is
Yeah,
America's largest privately owned home, America's castle. But I was on the public relations staff for Biltmore Estate for 6 years. So I had,
really.
yes. So I have some pretty good insider knowledge. And I started thinking about it and thinking, well, how can I take a castle and make it fit my Appalachian brand? And I started thinking about Biltmore Estate Industries. So George and Edith Vanderbilt invested deeply in it was really a charity to teach young Appalachians how to do woodworking and weaving and handcrafts that were native to Appalachia. And so I was like, that's my in. That's kind of my side of Appalachia. And then I can tie in Biltmore Estate and the 100th anniversary of Cornelia Vanderbilt's wedding and do some fun sparkly Biltmore stuff as well.
And I think that's what I love about the Biltmore is I've been to Europe several times with my day job, teaching at Purdue, taking students over there, doing study abroad. And there's something about Europe that we don't have here, which is like the history and the
Mm.
architecture and all of that. And then you go to the Biltmore and you're like, oh, we have this little tiny pocket where you could almost feel, even then it only goes back to like 1880, what, 85, 88, something like
Yeah.
that. So it's not really that old, but you start to feel some of that history and that gravitas of here's this really big old building. And but it's still not quite the same, but it's our little jewel and it's tucked in
Well,
there.
and there are things in Biltmore House that do go back hundreds
Yes,
of years. I mean, tapestries that are 500 or 600
exactly.
years old, and the furnishings and the art. So it does bring a lot of that. And there's just so many neat little tidbits of history tied to Biltmore House. Art was stored there during World War II to protect it, to
Yes.
keep it safe. I mean, there's just all these great little stories. And I felt like the Biltmore Estate Industries, which eventually became just Biltmore Industries, was a piece that a lot of people don't know about and didn't realize just how philanthropic the Vanderbilts
Mhm.
were. So I wanted to shed a little light on that.
Yeah, and I love that because when you go and depending on the tour you take and depending on what you see, like I, of course, immediately picked up on the World War II history because that's what I see when I go anywhere. And then the third time I went, I was like, oh, there's this whole arts and crafts industry piece to it. But it took like the third visit before that popped up onto like um, what I was seeing as I walked around. And so tell us more about that, because that's really what the book is about. The idea of what they were doing with bringing in the locals, bringing in the Appalachian people, and giving them an opportunity to learn trades, to learn craftsmanship as they were building this monstrosity in the middle of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Yeah, I often thought when I worked there, I would think about how George Vanderbilt was building this castle at the same time that my great grandmother was hoeing corn, just a
Yeah.
little ways up the mountain from him. And the Biltmore Industries side of it, there were these two missionaries, these two ladies who wanted to go. They wanted to be missionaries in China, but one of them had a mother who was not well, and so they came to Asheville to take the air. Which is Asheville was this health resort basically, and George and Edith Vanderbilt got very involved in, especially Edith, in really helping the people of Appalachia. And Cornelia Vanderbilt was so much a part of the community. You think of her as a princess almost living in a castle, but the locals called her Tar Heel Nell, which, Tar Heels in North Carolina. That's an honorarium.
Yep.
And she interacted with the children of the estate staff, and she was a common sight in Biltmore Village. So she was really the people's princess, I guess you would say. And they had this close bond. And George and Edith, the way they tried to help the people, and there was this terrible flood, which is part of the book. And Edith Vanderbilt there's a scene in the book where she's out there in her car with blankets. That's true. She actually came out and helped people. When Cornelia got married, they sent a car for the guy who manned the lodge gate to bring him to the wedding. There was an entire section of the church that was set aside for estate staff. So they had this amazing relationship with the local people. It wasn't the rich people up on the hill and then the people of Asheville. They were very much interconnected.
I love that. So when you were doing all this research, I mean, you worked there for 6 years, you were in the publicity department, so you probably knew a lot of the history and everything even before you started the story. But what surprised you as you started digging in? Were there moments where you were like, oh, I didn't know that. That has to go into the book.
There was one moment, it was so funny. I mean, I had talked about Cornelia Vanderbilt's wedding to so many reporters over so many years, and we would talk about the wedding breakfast in the Winter Garden. And as I was researching the actual wedding, I was like, wait a minute, they're having lunch. This is in the afternoon. Why is it a wedding breakfast? So I emailed the head of the curatorial staff at Biltmore. I was like, I have talked about this 100 times. And now I'm suddenly very confused about why this is a breakfast. And she explained to me that in Europe, there was a tradition of a wedding breakfast, especially in Britain. And you called it a breakfast no matter what time of day it was. It was the
Oh, that's so
tradition
funny.
as opposed to the meal. So I kind of have a little moment of explaining that in the book because I thought, oh my gosh, have I been doing this wrong for 20 years? So it was neat to dig in and really get into those fine details
Yeah.
that I didn't necessarily pay attention to when I was working there.
It's so funny because there are those things that we think we know. And then when
Right.
we're researching and we're writing the books, and we have to care so deeply. And I think we really do as authors of novels. I think most of us fall into the camp where we care incredibly deeply about getting the details right.
Yes.
Um, that then we'll be like, wait, I thought I knew it. And now I'm just not so sure. And then you have to keep digging. And
Yes.
there are those times my husband's like, I thought you were writing tonight and I haven't heard the keyboard at all. And I'm like, but I am. It's just this research is taking me down this terrible rabbit hole I'm
Yes.
never going to get out of.
Like I have to know precisely what time of day and what season of the year. And yes, I feel your pain. I
Yeah.
was doing that last night on a new work. I was like, all I'm doing is researching. I haven't put a word on the page.
Yeah, and then it's always like, and where do we stop? At what point do we
Right.
go, okay, it's enough. It's enough. I have to stop. And it's good enough. It's enough research that I could be like, okay, I've done my due diligence. And that's a hard line to draw. How do you know when you could say enough?
And the other temptation um is to include things that aren't pertinent to the story just because
Yes.
they're so cool.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of little bits and pieces that I was like, oh my gosh, I love that. And there's a scene where it's Cornelia's birthday, and I found what the estate staff gave Cornelia for her birthday. And so I'm like, this is what they actually gave her. And so I was so excited to include that in the book. But there's another scene where she's having it's actually the same birthday. She's having a costume ball, and there's a conveyance that she enters in. And so I'm having the estate staff build that. And initially I was like, okay, I got to find out exactly how they built it and exactly what it looked like and all these fine details. And then finally I was like, you know what? I think I can probably, make this up a little bit. I know
Yeah.
that this is the fact that she dressed in this costume and she came into the party in this way. But beyond that, I probably can go ahead and just be creative. And I did send the initial copy of the book to Kathy Barnhart, who is a former floral displays manager. She's the woman who for so long was in charge of Christmas at Biltmore Estate.
Oh my gosh, what a job.
Yes. So she is incredibly versed in the history. And I asked her if she would read it and make sure I hadn't gotten anything horribly wrong. And
Yeah.
she assured me that she didn't stumble on anything. So that was a relief.
That's awesome. What a great resource, because that would be, you're dealing with something that's so real, and it is a living memorial in a lot of ways because people still are going through it all the
Mhm.
time and we can see it. And so there are going to be some people who read it and then are like, "Oh, that's the Biltmore." And then they're going to go and they're going to be like, "Wait a minute. That's not how I imagined it," or whatever. And so to get it just right is, but there is a point where you could go,
Yeah.
but that was 100 years ago now.
Yes.
So I can do a little bit of license because we could drive ourselves crazy trying to get every detail right
Yes.
when we just can't or don't need to.
My first three or four novels were set in a historical time period, but they were not set in a real historical place. My
Yeah.
first novel that was set in a real historical place, I gotta look over and see the titles. Um, which one was it? When Silence Sings. Um, I picked a historical place in West Virginia, Thurmond, West Virginia, that is it's a ghost town, part of the National
Oh,
Park Service. And I looked it up. The actual number of residents of that town is 7. And I thought, if I'm going to set a novel in a historical place for the first time, a real place, I'm going to pick a place with so few people that only 7 people can be mad at me if I get it wrong. And now I have
that,
moved to writing about Biltmore Estate, which is passionately beloved by
yeah.
so many people. I mean, there are people who are just fans of Biltmore Estate who probably know more than I do about the estate. And so I was like, man, I have got to get this right, or people will totally call me out.
So is there a theme, like an overarching theme to these tangled threads that you're hoping, or that as you were writing it, you're like, okay, this is the purpose of the book? Or as you looked back, you were like, wow, I didn't see that, but now it's kind of woven through the tapestry of the pages.
So I try not to come up with a theme in advance because then you end up writing to it and not necessarily it feeling organic. But
Mhm.
one thing that I have been kind of meaning to write about for a long time, I've been involved in children's ministry for a lot of my career, and looking at childhood trauma and how that
Mm,
affects us as adults. So all 3 of my main characters gain that's a different book.
yeah.
Lorna, Lorna, um, does this happen to you where
Oh,
characters'
all the
names go
time.
out of your head?
Yeah. I have to sit there and go,
Lorna,
oh, yeah.
Arthur, Lorna, Arthur, and Gentry. That's where I
Yeah.
got confused. They all 3, uh, and the book is written from all 3 of their points of view. They've all 3 experienced abandonment and childhood
Mm,
trauma. Gentry has been basically abandoned by her mother. She thinks her mother is dead. Her grandfather was cruel. Arthur was rejected by his parents and raised by the church. And Lorna is an orphan at this point. Both of her parents have died. So they've all experienced this
Mm.
childhood loss. And each one of them deals with it in a very different way. And I wanted to really explore the different directions we can go as adults
Yeah.
dealing with those traumas from childhood.
Yeah, and that's such a rich and important theme to explore, and one that is easier to explore in fiction
Yes.
than because it gives us just enough distance and yet allows us to go deeply into what are the characters feeling and how are they
Yeah.
experiencing it. And so I think sometimes it's easier to allow ourselves to go into that when it's fiction because of that slight distance, rather than nonfiction where we're like, oh, now I have to look very deeply at myself.
Yeah.
And so it's important to have novels that are dealing with topics like that. So, how did God meet you in the writing of this story?
Um, in I had dealt with so many kids who had overcome incredible challenges of trauma. And the book is dedicated to some of the young people that I have worked with in ministry.
Mm.
And most of those young people have now gone on. I look at my Facebook feed. First of all, it reminds me that I'm old enough to be a grandma. But but I look at, I'm Facebook friends with a lot of these kids that I met, it's 16, 18, 20 years ago. And they're now working and they have families of their own and they have worked through those horrible things. These were kids who were in the foster care system, they were in a group care facility. And to see how they have overcome, it was just an honor to write about that. I had a great childhood. I had beautiful parents. And of course, there's the hard things in anybody's
Mhm.
childhood. But comparatively, I had pretty smooth sailing. And so
Yeah.
to be able to honor and examine the lives of all these kids that kind of are cobbled together as these three characters was
Yeah.
just special in a way that I hadn't anticipated when I started the book.
That's beautiful. So, when you're writing a book like this, what does your day look like? Are you, because you don't just write, you
No.
have another job, kind of like I do. So, you're kind of cramming it into the crevices. So, what does your life look like? What's the rhythm?
So I get up, do my day, go to work, do the job. When I get home in the evening, I walk the dog, and she's sleeping right here behind me at the moment. So I take Thistle for a walk, and then my husband and I make dinner. We have dinner together, and then I try to write 1,000 words. That's my goal every evening when I'm on deadline, is to write 1,000 words. And of course, like we were talking, we get bogged down in research, and suddenly you've written
Yeah.
10 words, but they're
Yeah.
perfect, dang it.
Yeah.
So that's, and the goal is about 5,000 words a week on average. So I give myself some flexibility there. And that seems to work pretty well for me. I actually really look forward to this time in the evening where I get to kind of re-enter another world where I get to decide exactly what happens. And it's a treat at the end of the day, to be able to enter the world of writing and dig into whatever story I'm currently working on.
Love that. And it's all about finding the rhythm that works. And so that's great. And 1,000 words a day, that's really doable. And it's a
It's
great
it's so
pacing.
it's funny. One day time I sat down and I wrote. It was when I was writing the Thurman novel, and it was the middle too, which is where you're usually like just grinding it out, and
Yeah.
the middle can be so hard. And I sat down and I was like, oh, I know this is the fire, and I know it's going to happen. And I look up, and 6,000 words. I have written six. I know. I
That
was
feels
just,
so good.
it feels so good. And I was like, okay. So then you start doing the math. Okay, if I can write 6,000 words every evening, I can write that. And never since then have I hit that again.
But that day
But
was
that
fire.
day.
That's the best. I've had a few of those, but usually it's because the deadline is looming and I'm
Right.
like, I have to. So I have a few of those coming up in the
Yeah.
next couple of weeks, I think. So when you're writing, is it energizing or does it exhaust you?
Oh, I no, it's it's initially energizing, but I use up the energy.
Yeah.
Like when I sit down, I'm energized and I'm excited, and then I get into it, and when I first start writing, I'll write a couple paragraphs and I'll look at my word count and I'm like 150 words. This is terrible. But then you kind of get into the flow,
Hmm.
and it's coming, and you're excited and your characters are speaking to you, and then you look up and you're like, oh, 800 words, that's more like it. And then
Yeah.
I kind of have, I think the 1,000 words is not so much that's like what I need to do, as that's what I'm built to do. Because once I get much past that, I typically, the energy then starts to taper off. And even if I'm still excited about what's happening next, I've kind of burnt up the adrenaline,
Yeah.
and I'm starting to think about how cozy my bed would be, and how nice a big mug of tea would taste.
Yeah. And I think that's important because we all have different rhythms and pacing. And so, like, I know when I am in the flow, I should be writing 2,000 words a night.
Mm,
And that's about a chapter. But that means I know where the story's going and I've done my research and I've got a pretty good idea. And so that's about an hour and a half, but that's my
yeah,
pacing. And so, and that's, I'm on task. I'm not being distracted. I can get that 2,000 words done. But then there are days I have to give myself a little grace and go,
yeah,
my day job consumed my brain, and I'm going to be lucky to get 1,000 words done. Um, but then there are other days I'm like, if I get 1,000 words done, I was lazy. And so I have to
right.
kind of know what all else has been going on. And so that's been interesting to try and figure out, okay, where am I? What else has been going on in my life? And then kind of give myself the grace or the get your butt in gear, Putman, and let's get it going.
I
Because it
do
just kind
I
of
do try
depends.
to get some words on the page
Yeah.
every time I sit down to write.
Yeah.
Um, and there are sometimes when you have an evening event or there's something else going on,
Yeah.
and that's just say this is not the night I'm gonna write. But if I do sit down, I never say, well, it's just not. I'm not feeling it tonight. Um,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm gonna write a sentence, and then
Yeah.
that sentence will typically lead to a paragraph, which will typically lead to a page. But if I've found that if I can just do it,
Yeah.
people always ask me, I say, do you want to know the secret to writing a book? Write it. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, exactly. It's get your butt in the chair and your fingers on the keyboard
Yes,
consistently
do
over
it.
and over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that is awesome. Okay, so a couple of really fast questions for you as we wrap up.
Okay.
I think I know the answer to this one already. Tea or coffee?
Tea. And
Um, and
I'm decaffeinated, sugar free, which my dad always called aggravated water.
yeah, I like that. Sweet or salty?
Uh, um, I I ate a little sweet and then I want a little salty, and I ate a little salty and then I want a little sweet. I'm
You're pretty balanced
so
then.
bad.
Yeah. And then what do you do for you?
I I walk my dog. I hike. I get out
I
in
love
the
that.
woods. I'm a mountain girl. I grew up on a farm. If I don't get a dose of the woods every day, I get twitchy.
I love that. I think you and I would be good friends. And then the last one is if you could hang out with an author for a day, who would you choose?
Wendell Berry.
Ooh,
He writes poetry, essays,
yeah.
fiction, and I adore everything he writes. And he's from Kentucky, so he's Appalachia, and he's just a down to earth. I got to meet him one time. I have a signed poster of his and all of his
Oh,
books.
fun.
I just think, he and I would go for a walk on his farm and talk philosophy.
That sounds so fun. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It was so great to hear about your writing and learn more about the story behind These Tangled Threads. And it is a great book. And I think everyone who's listening should go and get a copy because number one, I adore the Biltmore. So anything written out about it is going to be fantastic. But number two, it's just very clear that you have a passion for it, which will make the book even better. So thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so glad to be here.